Hello, this is Adam from the podcast series Here is the Horror. Before today's episode, I have a short announcement about the series going forward. Due to limited time for production, my co-host Daniel and I have agreed that all future episodes will need to be a bit shorter in length. Some listeners have also said that they would prefer a shorter length, so hopefully this benefits everyone. Our recording of an episode covering the Silent Hill series ran especially long, so we'll be cutting the episode into 3 mini-sodes about the series, released across this week. Our regular show will resume as usual the following week, but for now, thanks for listening, enjoy the mini-sode, and stay horrified.
Today, on Here is the Horror.
What is it? Still has an unusually high fever. Eyes don't open. Getting a pulse, but just barely breathing. Her skin is all charred. Even when I change the bandages, the blood and pus just start oozing through. Why? What is keeping that child alive?
I'm Adam.
And I'm Daniel.
And this is Here is the Horror, our horror podcast where we discuss all things horror, from games to literature to movies and more. And this is our 4th episode. Did you have any topic in mind for today, Daniel?
I've been thinking about a few, but I couldn't really decide on one.
Oh, okay. Well, that might be a problem. I've been kind of racking my brain too, but maybe if we just talk about what we've been getting into lately, we can move into it and... Wait. Do you hear that? What is that?
I have no clue.
Sounds like sirens. Is it getting a bit foggy here?
Why is the paint peeling off my walls?
So it looks like we've been teleported to the other world. So I guess today's topic is going to be Silent Hill. And we talked about this a bit prior, and I think we agreed that we're just going to be focusing on the games. I'm sure we'll mention the movies briefly in passing.
Or they'll get their own episode.
I mean, it's very possible someday. But yeah, we'll get to those in a bit. But as usual for this show, we'll open with discussing what's been going on currently and what we've been watching and getting into horror-wise. I don't have a lot myself this week, so why don't you go ahead and start, and I'll just slip mine in between.
Alright, well, this past week I call it #Alive. It's a 2020 South Korean zombie film. It was very reminiscent to me, or in a similar vein, to 28 Days Later. It deals a lot with isolation, and there's an extra caveat being the time we're in. It deals kind of with society's reliance on technology. It has some good effects, and the acting is really decent, especially some of the zombies. The ones that are featured prominently have this movement to them that is akin almost to Sadako from the Ring series, and you get a great late game villain. You can watch that on Netflix right now. That's a #Alive. I managed to catch the sequel to 2017's The Babysitter Killer Queen.
I'm going to need you to be a little spoiler avoidy on that one, because I've only gotten about halfway through it myself.
That's fine. I found it really enjoyable. I thought it was different enough from the first film to not be just a complete and total retread, but it maintained enough connection to the first movie that it was just as enjoyable. Everything I liked about the first film was here with a little bit of extras. That's on Netflix right now. Due to some interaction I had with one of the followers on Twitter, I busted out my Johnny the Homicidal Maniac director's cut from 1997. It collects issues 1 through 7 of Johnny the Homicidal Maniac. You'll get a lot of the filler comics that were done over the years. And I did find out that Johnny Vasquez still maintains the Johnny the Homicidal Maniac Twitter account, which you can follow at Johnny_C.
On the Johnny the Homicidal Maniac Twitter, like what does he post there?
He posts as Johnny the Homicidal Maniac.
Oh, it's like in character, like funny tweets.
Yes, one of the most recent tweets is Johnny asking, "So I'm confused. Is it not, or is it okay for me to wear other people's face as a mask?" I also caught up on a game that had a lot of nostalgic value for me. I found it on Download Safari in high school when I was 15 or 16. It's called Friday the 13th Return to Camp Blood by Vista Productions.
No.
It's a really fun game. It's very short, and one might be remiss to even consider it a game. It's more like a point and click.
It's more like a slasher color by numbers. You just go up to the place and press the button and the kill happens.
Yeah, it's like a rail shooter if it was a serial killer simulator. I couldn't find the games for years. Places like Download Safari don't exist anymore. But I found the YouTube channel for Vista Productions, and despite the video trailer for Friday the 13th Return to Camp Blood being uploaded 8 or 9 years ago, the person who maintains the channel actually recently went back and added download links for Friday the 13th, their Halloween, their Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and their A Nightmare on Elm Street games. You can find the links on all the videos. You can find them on YouTube. Look for Vista Productions. I will add that they are definitely not safe for work.
A few horror movies are.
And that's about it for me this week.
Oh, okay. Well, like I said, I watched a little bit of The Babysitter, but I didn't get too far into it. Only about, not even quite halfway, so not even really before the horror kicks in. Enjoying it so far, though, but of course at the point I'm at in it, it's mostly just some high school drama other than some interesting visuals for the main character's PTSD from the last movie, I guess.
Raisinets or goobers?
Raisinets. I don't think I know anybody that's ever had goobers.
I like them. Just chocolate-covered peanuts.
Oh, I didn't even know what they are. I was about to ask.
That's just a little Happy Noodle Boy quote.
And I've been playing through a bunch of the Silent Hill games recently just to sort of refresh myself for today's episode, and in the process of studying for that, I was looking through the Book of Lost Memories, which is a book the devs made that covered a whole bunch of stuff about the first 3 games and the history of the town and the setting and so on, and it has a section near the back where they discuss things that were inspirational to them developing the games, and going through that list, I saw something mentioned on there was a 1998 movie called Phantoms, and I decided to go ahead and watch that on a whim. Which I hadn't heard of this, but apparently everybody I know had heard of this and seen it.
But Affleck was the bomb in Phantoms.
And just in the opening of that movie, I was really impressed by the cast. Like you said, Ben Affleck, but also had like a Liev Schreiber in it. And anyway, the movie opening, I saw that was based on a Dean Koontz book. And actually, I think in the Book of Lost Memories, they were actually recommending the book, not the movie. But I didn't have time for that before the episode, so I went with the movie. But the movie started out promising, had a really nice, classy horror vibe where it's just a girl and her sister come back to a town, and to their surprise, there's nobody there. And when they finally do start finding people, they're dead, and then it just slowly ramps up them finding more and more strange things like severed hands and decapitated heads. And then once people finally start showing up, it starts having more supernatural elements, like they'll walk past a desk and something will be on it that wasn't there a moment before, finding a bunch of people's jewelry piled up on a bed, but also anything metal that was in a person, like gold teeth and pacemakers. And at this point I was really into it and curious where it was going. Unfortunately, I think as the movie went on, it kind of went downhill pretty fast. Pretty much as soon as it reveals what the monster actually is, almost all the supernatural elements drop out, and it just sort of turns into like a sci-fi action movie almost.
But it does have sync horror, which I love.
Not too much of that. I mean, it does have a lot of focus on shots of drains because the cause of the problem in the city is in the sewers, but I think it only really has one time where anything actually comes out of the sinks.
Noises are scary enough. I mean, Beverly Marsh, I would have left the bathroom when I started hearing the girl talking to me from the drain. I wouldn't have waited around to get splashed with blood or have balloons come floating out of it. I've just watched too many horror movies to trust any unnatural sound coming from plumbing. And Ghoulies 2 taught me to never sit down on the toilet without looking inside of it first.
Alright, well, if that covers everything we've been watching lately, then I guess that brings us up to the news.
I've got a couple of good things. The new Unsolved Mystery series that debuted this year, they have a season 2 coming. It's supposed to debut on October 19th on Netflix. I liked the first season, despite the fact that they kind of ditched the anthology in an episode style. I always liked Unsolved Mysteries because you got to hear like 4 to 6 stories an episode, and the newer series, each episode just kind of covers one case. But from what I've seen of season 2 and teasers and what I've read about it, it seems like this season's going to have a bigger focus on paranormal and supernatural rather than focusing pretty much exclusively on true crime cases. Next, Shudder has started production on season 2 of the 2019 Creepshow. It's got a tentative release of 2021. They have released a few little tidbits of some of the episodes. I'm really looking forward to that. The first season, there wasn't really anything I saw that I didn't enjoy, and it stayed very truthful to the movies, whereas some of them are straight horror, but also a lot of them that have a slight mixture of comedic elements in them. The Walking Dead, AMC's 2010 adaptation of the excellent comic book, announced that the series is coming to an end. They're going to have a season 11 that is going to air over a period of 2 years. It's scheduled to end in 2022. But there's also a planned spinoff with Norman Reedus as Daryl and Melissa McBride as Carol that's set to premiere just a year later. Next piece of news I have is something that is really relevant to me. The new Candyman film has been pushed back to 2021. Very sad about that, but it's 2020, so what can you do? The last little bit of news I have for this week, a teaser for the Book of Blood on Hulu has been released. It's premiering October 7th. It is going to be an anthology series that is an adaptation of Clive Barker's Books of Blood. We've already had a couple of film adaptations. Some of them are really good. Some of them are really campy. Some of them... Midnight Meat Train in 2008, which is one of the more Lovecraftian stories in the books. But it kind of builds up off of the short story. I recommend watching it. Then we had The Book of Blood in 2008, which is based on the short stories The Book of Blood and On Jerusalem Street. We had Rawhead Rex in 1986, Candyman in 1992, which is based off of The Forbidden from the Books of Blood. Lord of Illusions in 1995, which is based on The Last Illusion from the Books of Blood. Dread in 2009. I've actually not seen this one. I don't really recall the story from the books. And then we have The Yattering and the Jack that was adapted into an episode of Tales from the Dark Side. I really like that story. I really like that episode. And I would love to see Pig's Blood Blues adapted into an episode. But that will about wrap up all the news I have for this week.
Yeah, outside of that, I think the only really other thing I had was just that Rob Savage, who had done that Host movie we spoke about, has apparently entered a deal with Blumhouse to do 3 films with them. So I guess he's moving on up. We'll see how those turn out. But yeah, that's really it for me. Unfortunately, been a busy week for me. Seems like they all are.
That's life. But at least you're not being chased through the woods by a machete-wielding, hockey mask-wearing maniac. Or a pork rind in a fedora while you're asleep.
Not that I know of, anyway. Alright, well, I guess if that wraps up news, then we can move on to our main topic, which is probably good because we have a lot of games to talk about. So, we'll be moving on to Silent Hill. Alright, so we're in the late 90s. At this point, the survival horror genre, as it came to be called, is really just started with Resident Evil coming out in 1996. Obviously, there were some horror games before that, like Alone in the Dark, or maybe even earlier stuff on NES, like Uninvited and Sweet Home. And you had other games that were based off Alone in the Dark, like Dr. Hauser on 3DO, but...
The Seventh Guest?
Yeah, but I think it can safely be said that almost all of these things, they were really games first that just sort of had like a horror flavor slapped on top of them almost.
Well, and with the Resident Evil series, it was really campy, especially in the first game. It almost purposely played to every trope it could from B-movies.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I mean, I loved Resident Evil back in the day.
Oh, me too.
And I still do.
As long as it don't end up a Jill sandwich. I hope this isn't Chris's blood.
Only if you're the master of unlocking can you avoid that fate. Well, don't worry, we'll get more and more. Well, don't worry, we'll get plenty of bad voice acting in Silent Hill. Radio? What's up with that radio?
That is one thing I will say about the Silent Hill series, is there is not an overabundance of elaborately designed mansions that have trapdoors and secret rooms that are unlocked by moving paintings or playing pianos.
You say that, but there are piano puzzles in this game.
Yeah, but you're in a supernatural town, so that makes more sense.
So I guess it feels like we're getting into it. So Silent Hill came out for the PlayStation in 1999. It was made by Konami, and basically the story, as I've come to understand it, is just that a few different devs working there had some trouble with their recent projects, and the higher-ups basically said, based on the success of the Resident Evil, that they thought they should try to do a horror game. So it was mostly a team of pretty young up-and-comers that got together to make a pretty unsupervised game, and Silent Hill was just much more of a all-out horror game than anything we'd seen prior. Resident Evil had, the zombies and the blood, but Silent Hill has like this crashing industrial soundtrack while you're running through darkness, barely able to see, while things are like nipping at your heels, and you're seeing flayed bodies on the wall caught in barbed wire, and waking up in and out of dreams and not really sure what's reality anymore. And the people that made it, they were really struggling really hard to try to get that horror movie vibe. It wasn't a game and then they gave it a horror coat of paint. It was, we want to tell a horror story, and how can we do that as a video game?
And a lot of that really plays to the strengths of Silent Hill, like Akira Yamaoka. The industrial music, he wanted to use it to kind of enhance the rusty, decrepit, urban feel of the first Silent Hill game, particularly in the other world, when you already have this decayed urban area and it just goes to 11.
Yeah, like you said, a really industrial sound. A lot of like trip hop elements too, like even in like the opening song, it's got that sort of broken drum loops going underneath the guitar in it. And I know he said that one of his biggest inspirations was Trent Reznor from Nine Inch Nails, although he also cited some other people as inspirations to him, like Angelo Badalamenti, the composer for Twin Peaks, and also I think he even mentioned like Metallica and Depeche Mode. I'm not sure how much that shows in his Silent Hill work, but I think that you can also see Portishead posters in the game, which I think indicates more of that trip-hop influence. And even when we get to it later, the drug that the cult in the game is distributing to the tourists, PTV, is a reference to Psychic TV, which is an English experimental band. It didn't really make much sense to me when I was browsing through their music, but I eventually found an album that some of the members of Psychic TV did called Sugar Morphoses, and if you listen to that, you can hear some definite Silent Hill style tones in that. But yeah, we'll move on to the other developers in a moment here, but I think Akira Yamaoka's influence stands out just because of how standout the soundtrack was, and also just that he was one of the members of the original team that stayed with the series the longest. And he didn't just do the music either, he also did all the sound effects for Silent Hill 1.
And I've talked before, especially with a lot of the European horror films, a lot of full sheet stuff, the soundtrack itself is so evocative of what you're experiencing that it's almost a character itself. I think a large part of Silent Hill's appeal early on was that the music was so atmospheric, it enhanced the game to a degree that, for me personally, I hadn't experienced since, maybe Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy VI on the Super Nintendo.
Yeah, and we're focusing on the music, but I mean, also the camera work. This was one of the first fully 3D horror games. I think Overblood's really the only other example, but that barely counts as a horror game. You're really just walking around. You're just walking around a space station solving puzzles, and there's some dead bodies every now and then. But this game on PS1 had fully 3D, and they take advantage of that with having really dynamic camera angles, almost like you would see in like Evil Dead, where the camera's like swiveling around and doing odd angles as you're running down hallways.
Speaking of it being fully 3D, that would create some technical limitations that would actually add to the game and later on become a part of the game's lore. Things like the fog and the heavy darkness, it created a really tense atmosphere, but a lot of that was done to hide technical limitations like render distance and stuff like that.
So yeah, the game sort of has two modes you alternate between, or the real world and the other world. And anytime you're in the real world, they mask the draw distance by having this intense oppressive fog. And anytime you're in the other world, they have this really deep darkness where you can barely see in front of you using a flashlight. Both of these come together to make it where even though it's a very open game, like much more than like Resident Evil, where you can just run down multiple city streets, it feels very claustrophobic all the time anyways.
Yes. Some other limitations on the time come into play with things like the FMVs. FMVs, for those of you that may not know, is full motion video. At this time, the CGI in these cutscenes usually looked better than the gameplay graphics, and they allowed a type of storytelling in between playing the game that was very new at this time. But the technical limitations gave us what I used to jokingly call the Konami look. Almost all of the characters in the game have these kind of distressed eyes that are just a little bit darker than they should be. The teeth look almost to me like zombie teeth.
Yeah, it's the teeth that always got me.
It creates an even more disturbing nature in an otherwise mundane situation where two characters are just talking. It still grants you this sense of unease.
Yeah, and all that CGI, that was all done by Takayoshi Sato. You'd think it would be a team, but it was actually all done by just one guy. It's actually a pretty interesting story if you look into it. This was at a time where CGI was relatively new, so he was on staff and training a lot of the senior people at Konami on how to do CG animation, and eventually he'd hit a point where he told them that if he wasn't allowed to be a CGI director for a game, he was going to stop teaching them. So they assigned him Silent Hill, but then they said, we're going to have somebody be your supervisor, and he's going to get the main credit because you're so young within the studio. And then he refused that, and they said, okay, fine, we'll give you the credit, but only if you do it all on your own. So he did it all on his own. Everything in those CGI scenes, the characters, the animations, the backgrounds, he did all that and just slept in the studio for the entirety of the time they were making it all.
So he called their bluff.
Yeah, I guess it worked out for him as he went on to be pretty important in Silent Hill 2, but we'll get there when we get there.
Well, another thing is the combat in Silent Hill 1. I think it had a lot to do with the experience the team had at the time with making this kind of game. The combat is kind of clunky, but it represents the limited use of melee weapons and the fact that Harry isn't Rambo. That was something for me that added to the experience, because in Resident Evil 2, if you aimed at something and shot, you were hitting it. Your knife had unlimited uses, but there wasn't an overabundance of melee weapons in that game anyways. But once again, it lends a sense of realism because you have this everyday guy who is thrust into this situation, and all of these mind-bending experiences are coming his way. That's not going to suddenly make him a special forces soldier.
And I do think Silent Hill 1 and most of the early games in the series are actually pretty on the easy side, really. Combat is, as you said, a bit clunky, but usually in most situations your goal is going to be to try to run from enemies and avoid them rather than outright fight them anyways, unless they're in an area you're going to be running back and forth through.
Yeah, but you know how I am when it comes to survival horror games. Just like in Resident Evil, the game expressly tells you many times that running is the better strategy a lot. I cannot do that in any kind of survival horror game. I cannot tell you how many game overs I've gotten because there's 4 enemies in a room. I have 6 bullets. It takes 3 bullets to kill each enemy, so I lose 3/4 of my health trying to knife the last enemy to death.
And like we said earlier, they have the flashlight that you can use to see in the darkness, and if you can turn it off, and if you do, you can see almost nothing, but they try to encourage this by making it where a lot of the monsters respond to the flashlight, so sometimes you have to make a choice of whether you want to leave it on to see where you're going or turn it off to try to sneak around monsters, but in my experience, for Silent Hill 1 at least, I just left it on all the time.
Me too. That goes along with some of the more notable mechanics in this game. You had no HUD, heads-up display, so you had to go into the menu to check your health, which you had to do this beforehand in other games. But that in that situation, in those types of games, that always makes it more suspenseful for me, because even though you get these physical cues about the health level you're at, you don't know if they're holding their side because they've dropped from green to yellow or if they've dropped from green to red.
The lack of HUD's really important for horror games especially too, because any game that has a HUD, your eyes are going to be drawn there quite frequently to check on your status, check your ammo, and God forbid if you have a mini-map, you'll almost look at that more than the actual game. But for a horror game, it's really important to be able to draw the viewer's eye to create these sort of like tense and jumpy moments, and so I think the lack of HUD really works better for horror.
Well, and if you had the DualShock controller at the time, it's standard fare for consoles now, but you got to remember this is 1999. You had to shell out extra money to get a DualShock controller. You could actually track your health with the DualShock controller, because as you became more hurt, your controller would shake more violently. You had the radio static that could detect when monsters were nearby. That was something that I don't recall ever experiencing in a game before, except for maybe the NES era Ghostbuster games.
No, I don't know.
You know, you had an on-the-map PKE meter, basically, but that's not the same.
Real quick, while you're talking about the radio, I think that actually served a pretty good dual purpose, because one, like we said, there's the big limitation with the render distance, so you can never really see what's ahead of you too well when you're running. So the radio serves a very practical purpose, from letting you know when something is near before you can even see it.
Yes, it's very jarring.
But that also works really good from a horror perspective. Even before the monster's there, you can hear that it's getting closer and closer from how loud and staticky and distorted your radio's getting. And then, of course, they do some nice subversions with that, like when you're in the elementary school where they have the harmless ghosts wandering around that will trigger your radio. So be coming up around a corner and hear the radio going crazy, and you'll turn the corner and be ready to fight or flight, and then see it's just one of those harmless little kid ghosts.
I hate the school. One nice thing about the light, too, I really enjoyed that you had to have the light on to check your map. That was a nice little feature. So if you're lost in some point in the game and you know that there's enemies around, but you have no idea where to go, you've got to make that decision. Do I turn on my light so I can check my map real quick? Or do I just keep running around like a chicken with its head cut off?
Yeah, and actually the map's really cool too, because most games at that time, they just had very video gamey maps where you just open a menu and it sort of shows these rooms you've been in, these are the ones you haven't. But Silent Hill tried to have a sort of realism-based one where you actually find a paper map and look at the paper map, and the whole time you're exploring, he's like scribbling on it with red ink, marking off where roads are collapsed, what doors don't work, what doors do, circling where there's puzzles, and it fills all that out for you, which is really useful for your own navigation, but also I just thought it was a really nice touch. And then they play with that some, like, I know Silent Hill 3 does it, I can't remember if Silent Hill 1 does for the last area, has the map's like a kid's drawing of the area instead of a proper map.
So that takes us into the actual gameplay. We open up with a man, Harry, and his daughter Cheryl driving down a road. While this is happening, a little girl runs across the street, which leads to Harry and Cheryl crashing. A small time later, Harry awakens to find that his daughter has disappeared. This would set off his mission into Silent Hill. He goes looking for his daughter like most parents would, and he bumps into Sybil, the police officer.
And we can't forget that when he first goes to chase after his daughter, he ends up running down a dark hallway made of barbed wire, finding flayed bodies on the walls, and then immediately afterwards a horde of nightmare children with knives come up and stab him to death, only then that he wakes up in the diner.
Yes, the horrible baby knife scene. I will never forget the amount of amusement and laughter you had at my expense. Because the first time I played the game, you had already started playing it, and you refused to tell me anything about what to expect. So when we get to that point, I spent an amount of time that was impractical trying to survive there. And you were laughing, you were amused, and finally you just got to the point where you're like, Daniel, there's no way to make it out of here. They have to kill you.
I guess you were doing pretty good then.
Yeah, because I thought I was going to live. And it was just a very amusing point in my early exposure to Silent Hill. So spoilers, you can't survive the babies.
Yeah, and I guess we should go ahead and preface now. This is going to be a very spoiler-heavy show, so if you haven't played any of these, then when we get to one you're worried about, you might want to just skip ahead a bit.
So yeah, Harry wakes up. It was all a nightmare sequence. Or was it?
Well, he did crash his car, and his kid is gone.
Either way, it's a nightmare.
Sybil tells him since she's a police officer, that she's going to look into it, and tells him to just chill there, but unfortunately that doesn't really work out for him.
No, it wouldn't.
Because that's when the radio goes off, then the pterodactyl breaks through the window, and after you finish killing that, that's when you start your proper adventure into Silent Hill. Yeah, and we're not going to go step by step for outlining the plot of these whole games, because then we'd be here all day. But just covering the broad strokes of what's distinct about the story and style of each game. You can definitely see in Silent Hill 1. Silent Hill 1, I think, has the most broad horror in it. It's like the monsters are kind of all over the place in their design, and while there is a cult present in it, they're very in the background and unfocused on. You also has all these segments of you finding rumors about hallucinogenic drug being circulated throughout the town called PTV that they make from a local flower. And it sort of gives you a whole lot of these different things to wonder about what's really going on here. Is this something being caused by the cult? Is this just something being caused by the drugs?
Okay, so shortly after Harry sets off on his own in a strange area, he would meet Dahlia. Dahlia will put you on your way to looking for Kaufman.
Well, what Dahlia actually does is she tells you that all this is being caused by an evil girl called Alessa, who's trying to summon a demon. And Dahlia tells you there's these seals all over town that Alessa's making to summon the demon. Although you'll find out near the end of the game that Dahlia's actually lying to you, and that Alessa's making those seals to try to stop the demon from being summoned.
Shortly thereafter this, you will meet one of the creepiest characters in the game, Lisa.
What do you mean? She's just a friendly nurse. She's just scared and happy that you're there to help her, Harry.
This time, once you finally meet Kaufman, eventually you're given the choice to where you can save him. This will later reveal that he is indeed involved in drug trafficking, and you find a hidden bottle of exorcism juice.
It's a nice red liquid that'll become more relevant later in the series.
You will finally bump into Sybil again, who now seems to be possessed, and you have to fight her. After this fight, you do have the option to save her, which will impact the ending of the game.
Using said exorcism juice.
Yes, and that's something you'll see a lot in the Silent Hill series. Resident Evil 3, you would have your quick decision event, and it was obvious those were going to affect the games, but in Silent Hill, you're often not given any indication, sometimes that you even have a choice in the outcome of how you handle a situation, even more so that it will have a profound impact on which ending you get in the game.
Well, in fact, it's very likely you'll get to the end of the game and not even have a very clear idea of what's even going on.
Yes.
It relies a lot on finding and reading a lot of specific notes scattered throughout the game.
Well, after the fight with Sybil, regardless of how you handle it, you run into the reason that I consider Lisa the most terrifying thing in this game. You get to have a nice scene with the bloody-faced Lisa, which grants you some exposition, and then she runs away.
Well, she doesn't run away, you run away. That scene actually gave me chills, because when you first encounter Lisa, she makes it sound like she just fell asleep and woke up and then everything had gone weird in the town. But it becomes clear that it's been like this for a while, and basically it seems like Lisa's been dead this whole time and is only slowly realizing it over the course of this game. So you have this scene where, as she realizes it, it becomes more evident in her appearance, and she's just getting covered with blood as she stumbles towards you, and Harry puts the door between him and her and is holding it shut while she bangs on the other side, sobbing and begging him to help her.
And it won't be too much longer that we learn the full truth about Lisa, and basically that she was completely and totally mentally broken by Alessa's condition.
I actually can't recall at what point they specify it, but I know at some point you can uncover that Lisa was also addicted to PTV, so I'm sure that didn't help either. But yeah, you also find that videotape of her where you discover she was Alessa's nurse, and in that videotape it has Lisa talking about how much she hates changing the bandages and about how awful and sticky, and I don't want to get too visceral with it, but it paints a pretty picture.
And the fact that you go in there every day to do it, and there's no improvement.
Yeah, because I guess we haven't really talked about Alessa much, but basically what it turns out is that she was a little girl with some supernatural powers that was bullied in school like a witch, and at some point the cult in the town tried to use some ritual to get her to birth a god for them, but it didn't work out and she got horribly burned, and part of her consciousness split off and became your adopted daughter, Cheryl. But while Alessa's original body just was kept alive through dark magics in the hospital, or possibly just from the fetus of the unborn god inside her.
Or her sheer desire for revenge. It's a lot of loathing to have. And as you stated, Harry learns the truth about the last 7 years, and I've got to say, he takes it in stride.
And last boss of the game, if you don't save Kaufman, is they get Alessa resurrected and you fight her as the incubator, and just as a glowing angel. Whereas if you did save Kaufman, even though he has ties to the cult, apparently he's decided he doesn't want to work with them anymore, and he'll show up and throw some of that red liquid on her to exorcise the demon from her. That red liquid will later get named, I'll probably mispronounce it, but I think it's Aglafotis, and then afterwards a big demon comes out of her and you fight that instead, which is the incubus. And yeah, so basically you'll get one of the two bad endings if you don't save Kaufman and kill the incubator, and you'll get one of the two good endings if you save Kaufman and fight the incubus. And the only difference between the two good and the two bad is whether or not you saved Sybil.
Yep. Out of the 5 endings of this game, you have the bad ending, which is basically Jacob's Ladder. This entire experience was just Harry's psyche collapsing as he was dying, and you learn that he never left the car after the wreck. You have the bad plus ending, in which Harry and Sybil run away together after defeating Alessa. You have a good ending, where you save Alessa, and you get a newborn Cheryl. You have the good plus ending, which is the same as a good ending, but Sybil comes along with you. Now, regardless of which of these endings you get, aside from the bad Jacob's Ladder ending, of course, Lisa is going to finally realize that Kaufman is a complete and total waste of humanity and will not let you save him. She forces him to stay behind and suffer forever like she has. There is one more ending that would start a trend in the series, and that is the joke ending in which Harry is abducted by UFOs.
Yeah, it seemed like you interpreted that scene as Lisa having a grudge against Kaufman, which is possible, because I know he was really heavily involved in the PTV circulation around town, which she was addicted to, so she could have blamed him for that or for her death. I always interpret it as just she was still loyal to Harry and appreciated what he'd done for her, so she was just taking out Kaufman to try to protect Harry.
True. After everything everyone's been through in this game, it is possible that holding the door shut on someone who has quickly become obsessed with not being alone could be forgivable when you've got undead nurses and spindly things crawling after you in the streets.
And I know you mentioned Jacob's Ladder. I think it's pretty well known that was a pretty big inspiration to the team. I've read numerous interviews where team members mention learning that other people on the staff of it we're also big fans of it.
Oh, yeah. This whole series takes a lot of inspiration from David Lynch, Jacob's Ladder, The Mist by Stephen King.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of Stephen King influence, but yeah, especially The Mist. I mean, even like most of the streets in the town are named after various horror authors, like they have a Kuntz Street and Bachman Boulevard or something.
Francis Bacon's has a huge influence in the game.
I know Masahiro Ito, monster designer and illustrator. I know he said he was inspired a lot by Francis Bacon. It was a pretty close-knit team, and I know even though they have like these official titles, in most interviews with them, they'll make it pretty clear that there was a lot of bleed over and who was working on what, and that they had a whole lot of meetings between the team about what would and wouldn't work.
It's a lot like an improv-heavy sitcom, where you have your writers, you have your directors, you have your actors, and all the other staff, but occasionally someone will pitch an idea outside of their bullpen and it works, so they use it. You can't do that on television. Janitors wrote some of the skits that were used in the show. It's very much like a family production.
Well, I think it definitely worked out with them. I think that kind of captures the vibes of, this small team and collaborating and the way, and how much some people like the CGI director, Takayoshi Sato, had to really put the blood and sweat in. I think that really helps give it that vibe that a lot of like indie horror films had too, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where everybody was sweltering under lights. And this game went on to be a huge success, so was awarded PlayStation Greatest Hits, which means it got a budget re-release on the console. And so obviously Silent Hill 2 was definitely going to happen, although the director for this game, Keiichiro Toyama, he would not be working on the second one. He would actually leave after this game, along with several other members of Team Silent, and they would go on to make the Siren games for Sony. This concludes today's mini-sode of Here's the Horror's 3-part series covering Silent Hill 1 through 3. Remember to subscribe and review Here's the Horror for free on the podcast service of your choice and on YouTube. You can also visit our website at here'sthehorror.com and follow Here's the Horror on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Have anything to say about horror films, games, or novels? Have any topics you'd like us to discuss? Questions, comments, and suggestions can be sent via email to hereisthehorror@gmail.com. Please consider subscribing to Here's the Horror on Patreon. Every little bit helps to support the podcast, and patrons gain access to bonus episodes and more. The opening song is Nightmare Machine by Kevin MacLeod. The interstitial songs are Supernatural Radio by Kevin MacLeod, The Visitor by Shane Ivers, and Engulfed by the Night by Darren Curtis. The closing song is Dealing with the Devil by Darren Curtis. Thank you for listening to today's mini-episode, and remember, stay horrified.
Damn it, I'm gonna have to redo that. Oh my god, I really like that joke for some reason.